In this section, you'll be learning how to use query statements to make the values in a control dynamic, dependent on input in another control, or reference data in a database. This section is a detour of sorts. For a short while, you'll be leaving the exciting world of Rocky Jupyter to concentrate on data binding itself without any use case to distract you. When you get back to the webforms site, you'll be more than prepared to tackle your first drop-down list. Data binding is an essential feature of both the mobile form language and the webforms language. It is perhaps the single most useful technique a mobile engine developer such as yourself can have. The basic idea is that instead of hard-coding a specific value for a control, you put a reference into the control, aka bind the control, to one or more properties of another control, to a reference table, or to a system parameter, and pull data into your control from them. You want to do this primarily because the data-bound control will always be up to date. Its value changes in real time when the referenced resource changes. Webforms flavor data binding is based on the SQLite query syntax, with the most important difference being that, unlike SQLite, it is strongly typed, which allows compile-time type checking. You won't need to be an expert on SQLite to use Webforms data binding, but if you do get stuck at any point, a SQLite tutorial will definitely help. First things first, since the examples below don't form part of the Rocky Jupyter scenario, you need a separate artifacts folder to hold them. Create a new folder and name it Web Data Binding. The first example uses a web form with a single text box. You will make the text attribute of this control data-bound. The most basic type of data binding is a query statement that returns a static result. In the webforms language, query statements are wrapped inside curly braces. In webforms, unless you're pulling data from a reference table, a table expression, or a table control, basically anything that you would need to reference using the from operator, you don't need the select keyword at the start of a query statement. Put a string inside the braces, and you've got yourself a data-bound control. Save your form and publish it through the MEBT without an input data spreadsheet. Then open the form on the webforms website. Notice that the text box displays the literal that you bound into it. Static query results have their uses when you want to give a drop-down or a text box a default value. But since they don't refer to any external data that could change, their value will always stay the same. There is much more to data binding than this. You can make the value of a control actually depend on the user input in another control by referencing the user-editable control in the query statement. The data-bound control will dynamically and in near real time take on the value of the referenced control. The second example has a text box control that asks the user a question. The answer is then bound into a text view control. In the web form language, all this takes is sticking a reference to the control in question into the query statement of the control. Use the ID of reference control .referenced property of the control syntax. Save, publish, and open this form online. Enter words into the text box and see them appear below. The data-bound text view displays the current value in the text box. If you'd like to reference and display a list of values or the rows of a table instead of a scalar value, you want to put something in the query statement that returns a table value. A reference table, a table controls rows properties, or a table expression. You'll see how to use each of these in a query statement. For this example, a table expression, a concept specific to web forms, should work best. You could put the table expression into any control that can display a list of values. but a table control seems the obvious choice. Table controls display data that is organized into rows and columns. Table controls in web forms rely on data binding to populate their rows and headers and footers, if any. The Table 1 table control records a record set property that specifies the source of the tabular data. In here is where we'll put the table expression, which is just a shorthand to organize data into rows and columns. Two SQLite select statements put together with the union all SQLite operator could return the same two columns and three rows, but this syntax is more readable. The table keyword in the record set property, not to be confused with the name of the control, sets up the expression and stitches together values into columns and rows. Fields in a row are separated by commas, and there is a semicolon separating each row in a table expression. The record iterator variable will be necessary to reference the rows that the record set query statement returns. The table control takes a row template defined by the children of the row element inside the table. The rows are generated via data binding based on the template. One row is generated for each record that the query statement and its record set property returns. In this case, since the record set query returns 3 rows, the template row will be generated 3 times. Data bind the 2 columns of the result of the query into 2 text boxes. You reference the rows that the query statements returns using the record iterator variable. The iterator variable cycles through each of the rows. In turn, you can use the iterator variable .columnName query to pull the value from each of the fields in a given column of a query result one by one. Create a second text box for the second column. Save the form, publish it, and access it online. The initial values of the controls of the table are taken from the table expression in the Table 1 record set. However, these controls are text boxes, so you can enter any text you like. You may very reasonably want to filter the rows that a table displays based on user input. This is quite easily done. Since it's the query statement in the record set property that determines what can be displayed in the row template, this is what you need to fiddle with to make filtering happen. All you need is some conventional SQLite query syntax in the record set property. Use a select from statement that includes a where and a like clause to return only the rows that match the input in the filter box text box. Save, publish, and open the form online to test the behavior. Neato! Just like the SQLite database language it is based on, Mobile Engine data binding includes functions to process the query results inside a query statement. Query functions are like the formulas in Microsoft Excel that count, average, round down or up, or make various calculations on a range of values in the spreadsheet. In fact, you've already used query functions. In the mobile form language flavor of data binding, you've counted and added up controls in your form. The web forms variety of data binding has way more query functions to process the data that the query returns. Create a table that contains 3 empty text boxes. In the record set property, write a table expression that returns 3 rows. The table will generate its 3 rows based on this expression. In the template of the table, define a text box that references the result of the table expression. You will write your favorite duck names in these text boxes, and the names will appear in the footer of the table. So create the footer. The footer contains a text view. Reference the text box values in a query statement inside this text view. The upper function converts the string in the list that the query statement returns to uppercase. The group_concat function joins them up with the separator you specify, because in this query you want to process not the result of the table's record set query, but the values entered in the text box controls inside the table. Instead of the record iterator you used in the row template, here you use the rows property of the table control to reference the controls in the row template. Save, publish, and open online. Enter text in the table to test the footer query. The functions you've used in the controls query of the footer convert the list of user input strings to uppercase and join them using the separator character that you specified. Dynamically showing or hiding content based on user input is something you simply have to be able to do. In the mobile form language version of data binding, you had to twist a dynamic list to make this happen. In webforms, there's a dedicated if element with a cond property purpose-built. The child elements of the if will only appear in the form if the condition evaluates to true, that is, if the user enters a number greater than 18 in the text box. Webforms queries are strongly typed, so you need to apply the toInt function to the user input to be able to compare it to an integer. Create a text view as a child element of this if element. Save, publish, and view online. Lie about your age if you must to make the age-restricted text appear. If the input in the text box meets the condition that you specify, the text below the text box is displayed. The complete data binding section has been building up to the drop-down list, and here it is. A drop-down is a typical candidate for data binding. The whole point of this type of control is to present dynamically updating options. The webforms implementation of the control, however, is slightly more involved than you'd expect. The choices property, which specifies the list of options in a dropdown, is a query that binds to a reference table, a table expression, or a table value property. No problem there. The dropdown, however, needs two more query statements that reference the query result returned in choices. One that returns a scalar or record value that identifies the options that the user can select. This is called the key map in the webforms world. In the text map property, the other query specifies the options that the dropdown presents to the user. You can reference the value that the user selected in a dropdown in a number of ways, using various properties of the dropdown control. Create the selected key text view and bind the dropdown selected key property into it, which references the identifier field, the one from the key map query of the selected row. Reference the property using the dropdown identifier .dropdown property format. Because the column that the keys are taken from holds integers, you'll need to run the toString function to convert the selected key to a string and display it in the text view control. Create the selected text view and bind the selected text property into it, which references the display field, the one from the text map query, of the selected row. This one is already a string, so you don't need to convert it. The selected value keyword references the complete selected row, warts and all. In the record that selected value returns, you can access the columns one by one using a dot and the names you gave the columns. Save, publish, open online, and find out about your options. The first steps to building a simple game in a web form are right here. Now that your data binding muscles are pumped, you're ready to get back to the new task web form and make it dynamic like it's nobody's business.